All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to this month's roundtable. We are the members of the International Relations and Foreign Policy Cluster from Nickel Dime, which is the official research and publication platform for Center for New Economic Studies. For today, our panelists are Mitrajit, myself, Thimant, Yashovardhan, Tanish, and Nakul. And the roundtable is going to be moderated by Sarah and Madhumita. So I would just request Sarah to start off with like a brief introduction of what we're going to be discussing today.
Thank you, Ishani, for the introduction. Moving forward, the topic that we'll be exploring and discussing in this episode of Roundtable is the increasing polarization in the global geopolitical order and the lack of multilateral cooperation on issues like climate change. To begin with, polarization is a process whereby the normal multiplicity of differences in a society increasingly align with along a single dimension, and people increasingly perceive and describe politics and society in terms of us versus them. Additionally, polarization is tearing at the seams of democracies around the world. And once a society becomes deeply divided, it is very difficult to heal from both the environmental and psychological aspect of it. Therefore, before talking about the remedial actions, it is crucial for us to understand why this problem is so thorny and difficult to overcome. Now, I shall open the floor to our speakers to discuss more about how have the conflicts among nations led to an increased polarization in this geopolitical order.
I think I would want to go ahead with that. So I think you asked something about how conflicts have sort of like led to polarization. I think if we take the example, it's like a very pertinent example, and we cannot not talk about it. It's the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and if we sort of relate it to what's happening at the G20, it has sort of led to it's a major hindrance in multilateral action or collective action, because often countries are divided on their stand, not divided, but like for example countries like India who are saying they're against war, but they're not really naming which countries like responsible for it in that sense. And then there's the West who are like going all out against Russia, and then there are other countries who might even like come in support of Russia against the West. So that is something that I feel can be seen as an example where conflicts have led to polarization and have sort of hindered collective action, like even in terms of say the United Nations. Therein you would expect, for example, the UNSC, the Security Council, which like its primary responsibility is to ensure that peace is maintained and war does not break out, and it was not able to do that thanks to the veto power of Russia. So any which ways, it just shows how these countries and these conflicts, they lead to like stalemate and blockade in collective action at a multilateral level. Yeah.
Thank you, Ishani. That was an interesting response and very well articulated. Now that we have a fair understanding of the how and why of the matter at hand, my next question would be leading towards what issues have resulted in the lack of multilateral cooperation in terms of climate change, and to what extent do such conflicts affect the living standards of its citizens? Yeah, Demon, go ahead.
Yes, so first of all, we would have to understand the fact that there's a global inequality in wealth. The Western countries are far more prosperous than the Eastern countries are. For example, even in Europe, if you look at the per capita income of Western European countries like Great Britain and France, they have a much more higher per capita income than Eastern European countries like Poland or Ukraine ever had. So now there's a division between the West and the East. And so the war in Ukraine is much more of a result of this division, that one side is exerting much more influence through its wealth in the global international sphere than the other side would. And now, secondly, we would have to understand that the divisions existed previously. But the fact was that there was an agreement that we should not wage war because war is bad. And there was a hope that this interconnectedness of markets, Russian gas coming to French homes, and etc., would prevent a war. But the fact is that we forget that states do not act like rational human beings do. The states act on a different level of thinking, have different mentality currently. And for Russia, cannot predict anything. Even in history, Russia has been extremely unpredictable. What it will do next? And the fact is that we have to understand that you cannot predict anything by simply looking at, oh no, the economy is doing well, we are interconnected, so there can be no war. This has broken the axiom that if the countries trade with each other a lot, there would be no war. That's a lie. We should have something other than trade to stop wars here.
Thank you so much, Dhiman. That was a comprehensive response. Nakul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think just in I want to add something to what Demon said. Other than the fact there's the inequality and per capita income, one thing that also helps in preventing war, especially in today's age, is the fact that there's a lot of nuclear power amongst many states that are prevalent today. Sort of to give you an example, just recently, if you've been following up the news quite a bit, South Korea, sorry, North Korea, they posted a photo. Kim Jong Un posted a photo with a couple saying that we have just recruited this many number of new soldiers, young soldiers, who are, I think now, I don't know how it was phrased, or I don't know the exact verbatim of it, but it was about something against the US. And then in response, the US also sort of gave a very hefty reply to it. I remember the commander saying that we will not be intimidated, and please rest assured someone else will raise your sons and daughters, something along that lines. So the fact is that income is inequality, and economics is not just the only thing that's preventing war right now. It's also the fact that these countries and a lot of people possess lot of nuclear power, which if unleashed could possibly not just lead to World War III, but also like the extinction of like proper countries and races.
I totally agree with you, Nakul, and war definitely has impact not only on our psychological well-being but also the current environment that we live in. Dima, do you wish to add anything else?
Yeah, adding to Nakul's point, the point here is that the nuclear weapons are important for preventing wars, but they won't prevent small aggressions. Like, for example, in India Pakistan case, the ceasefire violation actually went up after both sides acquired nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons provide you with a confidence. The other side won't escalate to a point that it would lead to a full on war. You can do anything you want till it reaches a point. So, I believe that nuclear weapons do help in preventing major wars. However, small wars, they don't help in preventing because small wars are dime a dozen right now. And you can have a small war without it reaching the nuclear weapons. And the point here is that nuclear weapons are important preventing large scale major wars on the thing of World War II or the First World War, but like fighting small wars like a small intrusion, a small skirmish, or just a small show of force, it won't prevent that because you need a lot of resources to mobilize a nuclear weapon at first. So I believe that nuclear weapons do help in preventing wars, but not in the small sense of things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Dimant. Yashovardhan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I think like it might be a different perspective, but like in regards to like how in the 21st century, how America, like America's hegemony has been on the decline, and even within like American borders, like how there is like growing polarization between the two-party system, and how the other countries have relied on like looking towards US to form some sort of consensus, I guess, and since that has been going out of the window, and there is obviously like the case of or the risk of rise of China as well. Other countries have, I think, resorted to building their national capacities, and they are also looking to like build upon their like comparative advantage in terms of the scientific research that they have done. So like at the end of the day, like the idea of multilateralism becomes a bit of an issue when like countries have like competing interests that they have to look towards. So even in the case of Ukraine-Russia war, while there was like condemnation of Russian actions, uh, like the threat of like a cold winter that Europe was about to experience in terms of its energy crisis that could have potentially happened, led also to Germany sort of tempering its expectation to not be very publicly vocal about how it wants to uh, condemn Russia, I guess. And I think that has also led to just like other countries trying to figure out where they fit into their um, regional power structures, I guess.
That's really insightful, Yashowardhan, and thought-provoking. Yeah, Shani, go ahead.
Uh, yeah, even I would just like want to add on a point that may be a little different from what others have been referring to. Um, so recently, this is something old, but I just recently read about it, how sanctions that US usually places on countries that affects the living standards of the citizens of those countries. So for instance, if we take the example of Iran has been under sanctions for very long now, and that has majorly affected the living standards of the people there, because that hurts the Iranian economy, and eventually it goes down, and reaches, like, it just affects the most vulnerable population the most. So that is something that I think again fits into the whole problem of how issues between countries. Herein, the issue was again the nuclear power and how Iran was trying to get it. US was against it, and then the end of the JCPOA deal, and eventually that led to US putting sanctions on Iran again, and how that affects not just multilateral cooperation in general, but also how it affects the living standards of citizens, especially the countries like Iran or even Iraq for that matter. Just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
Thank you, Shani. Yes, Yashowardhan, go ahead, please.
Sorry, just to add to like what Ishani was saying, I think since US had like a dominant power in the international monetary system as well, so it was able to utilize its sanctions effectively. But like even like in the past couple of decades, like other countries have started to realize that US is becoming overly reliant on using sanctions, so they are also trying to circumvent um, being affected by such sanctions. So again, like there is a multipolarity angle coming to, I think, the monetary system as well, where you could see like even before the Ukraine-Russia war started, the Russian central bank decided to shore up its gold reserves as well, so it wouldn't be as affected by the impending sanction that they were about to be, I think, put on with through the US. So I think, yeah, like even in terms of like the monetary system, I think uh, like there is a growing multipolar world that is about to, I think, happen.
That's a great example, and I definitely agree with you. Madhumita, over to you.
Thank you for the insightful answer and for highlighting how sanctions affect living standards and the multipolarity associated with the monetary system. So, now, as we talk about multilateralism in the context of climate change, there are certain challenges faced by groups which increasingly demands attention from developed countries and multilateral institutions for support. And we want to understand what these institutions can provide for these groups. So, essentially, with increasing climate change risks, what role should multilateral institutions play in mitigating its effects on small and developing countries and in accommodating climate refugees? Yeah, Tanish, go ahead.
There's a lot of developing countries that are dependent on like energy as one of the biggest exports. For like example, like Central Asian countries or Nigeria, for example. So I think multilateral institutions should provide like a more diversified like export to these countries. Otherwise, they would not be very pro, going against climate change.
Definitely agree with you. Energy security is definitely a concern faced by a lot of developing countries, especially after the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We can see how it has impacted the whole world. Yes, Deepat, if you want to add on to that.
Adding to Tanish's point, actually, there's also the point that many of the countries like India and China are into manufacturing. We manufacture tons of stuff, and many of that stuff is polluting. And the point is that that stuff is polluting, but it's important for the economic growth. So the point with the International Institute would be to how would you sell the point to the Indian and the Chinese governments? And the fact that the counter argument is very alarming. It's like Western colonization all over again, this time in the name of environment. And these countries want to limit our development by using environment as a plank. So the fact is that multilateralism can help in actually convincing these governments to start shifting to a greener alternative. Otherwise, all of these sides would soon start to think it as another form of colonization. It's just on the name of environment this time, and they would ignore it, as has been happening several times. So the fact is that international institutes can help by convincing the governments whose economies are growing, are emerging, to shift, because to convince them that it's for the betterment of all, not for just some Western countries thought it would be a good idea.
Definitely, there are a lot of advantages in shifting to a greener economy, both in terms of the environment as well as, sustainable development. Yes, Nakul, please go ahead.
One another thing is that multilateral institutions, especially like UNHCR, so it provides for something that's known as the Global Compact Framework. Now, the Global Compact Framework in itself also provides for institutions like MDBs, which are multilateral development banks, like the European Bank, Asian Development Bank, stuff like them. They ask the MDBs to specifically boost the investing in private sector. Now, when you boost your investment in private sector, you're basically fostering employment. So it helps to employ migrants and all the unemployed labor, because usually whenever migrants or any refugees migrate to a country, they're usually found in the form of cheap unpaid labor. So what the Global Compact Framework and UNHCR, all these multilateral institutions, the Asian Development Banks, all these, what they try to do is that they boost the investment in private sector so that it can generate and foster employment. And not only that, not only provide their family with basic standards of living, also teach them sustainable skills, which they in the future can also be transferred and can also be monetized further in the future as well. So yeah, there's that.
Thank you for highlighting that. That is very insightful. Yes, Ishani, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think I might be like sort of building on what Demon said, but maybe like I would be more theoretical about it. I guess there's this term called common but differentiated responsibility, and that I'm pretty sure everyone's aware of it. But like the gist of it is that because it's the developed world that was majorly responsible for the climate, the state of the climate right now, they should be more responsible for the repercussions of it, and they should also be more responsible again, like for countries like India and China, who are still in like a developing phase, majorly India and other developing countries, and their development should not be hindered because of the actions of the developed world and how that left the climate today. But again, that even though it's like a very valid point, that does make sense, but it's not something that's practical, because then the climate would be in a very bad state, and like then the least developed countries would come up and they'll be like, okay, now we want to develop, so we would just go on and do whatever with the climate. So in that sense, I think multilateral institutions play a huge role in sort of accommodating the different issues at hand, in the sense that sort of mediating between, say, the developed world, who would not want to take added responsibility, and the developing world, who would want them to take responsibility. And in that sense, something that can be done and should be done is the transfer of technology, because often what happens is that even though these countries would want to turn to like a greener economy, they're not able to, because they just do not have the facilities for it. So in that sense, what multilateral institutions should do is that make sure that there is adequate technology transfer from the developed world to the developing world, including India and the LDCs, for them to actually move to a greener economy without facing like any drawbacks of not being able to, say, develop or use the climate to their, or the resources to like their full potential. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There is also UNFCC has mandated developed countries to support developing countries for this purpose, but we're not sure about whether it's actually in place, whether it's in action right now. Yes, Yashwardhan, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, so something that I read recently was also how like developing countries are relying more on private actors to build their state capacity in tackling climate change. And while it's commendable to allow such players to also get involved in the process. The question of, I think, where these capacities reside in, and how the sovereignties of certain countries are affected by such projects should also be something that these institutions need to keep in mind. So like developing a framework where either through like a global taxation system or like a global carbon footprint tax, I guess, is something that is also needed to like just ensure that like all the countries are on a like similar or like an even level, I guess. And it's not just like certain countries who have that comparative advantage in building those capacities enjoy that those benefits.
Thank you for that. As you all may know, the G20 countries own up to about 85% of the world's GDP, and they have the potential to significantly transform the world and transition towards a greener economy. And we can already witness a lot of dialogue within the G20 with regards to food and energy security. However, there are still challenges that the G20 countries face in accelerating climate action with regard to global cooperation. If anyone can throw light on what these challenges are, that would be really fruitful for the discussion. Yes, Tanish, go ahead.
In a lot of G20 countries, there's a lot of lobbying done from corporations that might be involved in like the export of oil. So in countries like the United States, there will be companies that are lobbying the government to be against climate action. So that might be one of the disadvantages.
I agree with you, definitely. Yes, Dimant.
The fact is right now that there is a divide in G20 as well. There's a G7, the G8, the well-developed, high per capita income growth countries, and there's a G12, the rest, which are countries that are emerging, either emerging economies or large economies. So the fact here, the problem here that is that the G8 wants to maintain its current status of living, the current per capita income, the current all the goods and services, while at the same time trying to save the environment somehow. But the fact is that the growth they have achieved is unsustainable. It has at a point that it has to be dependent on the well-being of all the world. And the fact is that you need trading connections for that, and you need more and more of the earth. Like for example, to support the United States, it would require 3 to 4 more United States like countries to support the United States. And similarly, we have to understand the fact that G8 has built itself a castle of sand and hoping that, then the global market system, the global market economy will continue to work. While G12 currently are emerging countries. For example, India in the 1990s wouldn't have even dreamed of being in the G20, but now we are in the G20. China in the 70s was just a large country with very low per capita income. It was around approximately $75 or something. And now it is one of the second largest economy in the world. So the fact is that there's a competition between the emerging, the new order, and the old order. And both of these sides are trying to compete with each other. And the fact is that environment is also one of the things that they're going to compete on each other. So the G12 wants the G8 to take responsibility for the environment, while the G8 says responsibility for all the people. So we would have to understand that there's a game of ping pong going on between the G12 and the G8. And that's why there's this lack of multilateralism, this friction.
Thank you for highlighting that. That is a very interesting perspective to it. Yes, Sarah, please go ahead.
I had a very brief observation to make about the challenges with regards to G20. That is, the G20 represents only a part of world's population, and a good amount of approximate 173 countries are not members. And ways should be found to include the latter's concern. Therefore, the results of G20's developments policy have been very mixed. On one hand, the equal participation of up-and-coming powers of the global south, such as China, Brazil, India, South Africa, ensures that issues of global developments are coming into focus. While on the other hand, there is a danger that emerging countries will not be ready to make any adjustments to their development paths in the name of future viability.
Thank you for highlighting that. I definitely agree with you. There is a general divide with inclusivity and climate resilience and climate action within the G20 itself. Apart from that, I did read a lot about public dissatisfaction from not just G20, but COP27 and a lot of other similar summits. Climate change and environment, as you all know, are two very important things, and multilateral institutions and countries have to prioritize that, and since it has the potential to affect national security, keeping that in mind, global cooperation is, of course, I would say, the need of the hour to save vulnerable countries, climate refugees, and other small and developing nations. With the detrimental effects it may have on the economy and society, the stability of the global geopolitical order is key to moving forward with radical climate action. In that sense, I think we've had a very fruitful conversation about multilateralism and polarization and how it impacts climate action. We started out by discussing about how conflicts have led to an increased polarization, the issues which had collectively resulted in a lack of multilateral cooperation, and the extent to which these conflicts had an effect on living standards. In this regard, we discussed about per capita differences, nuclear power, building comparative advantage, and thereby national security, how competitive interest affects multilateralism, sanctions, and their impacts on living standards. After that, we discussed about climate refugees, small and developing countries, and what role multilateral institutions must play in providing them support. Finally, we concluded with the challenges the G20 and similar multilateral institutions face in terms of climate action. Thank you all for joining today, and we'll see you in the next roundtable discussion. Thank you.